Story number 1. The Ghost Base. A tale from the edge of nowhere. The wind was a constant howl as we trudged through the deep, unrelenting snow of Alaska's northernmost reaches. Ghost Base, they called it. Officially, it didn't exist. No one knew its true name. There were no signs, no markings, just a place that seemed to fade into the barren landscape like a dream half remembered. But it was real enough to us. Real enough to be the subject of every conversation in the taverns. The quiet buzz of curiosity that echoed through Anchorage like a whisper that refused to die. We had come here for one reason, to find the truth behind the rumors, to see if the stories were true. And, God help us, we were about to wish we hadn't. There were 5 of us. Me, the storyteller, the one with the nerve to lead the group. There was Carl, the mechanic, whose hands had the magic touch when it came to machines. He was here to see if the base still had anything left to scavenge. Then there was Natalie, a journalist who specialized in uncovering the dark corners of the world, hungry for a story she could sell. And then there were the twins, Jake and Matt, 2 guys with more guts than brains, always looking for the next thrill. Together, we formed the most unlikely team to venture into the dead silence of Ghost Base. We had heard the stories, the abandoned base hidden in the frozen wilderness, the doors that closed by themselves, the sense of being watched. But none of us really understood what we were getting into. The journey there was uneventful, a quiet, bumpy ride along snow-clad roads until we reached the outskirts of the forgotten base. At first glance, it seemed like any other abandoned military installation, decaying buildings, rusting gates, and the eerie stillness that clung to places where history had gone to die. But something was different here. The air tasted strange, thick, almost metallic, like static. You could feel the ground shift beneath your feet, as if the earth itself was unsettled by our presence. And then there was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, the kind you get when you're far away from civilization. No, this silence felt pregnant with something else, something watching. We stepped inside. The first building we entered was a long, rectangular structure, old concrete, chipped paint, and the lingering scent of mildew. The door slammed shut behind us as soon as we crossed the threshold. We all froze. Natalie jumped. Matt swore, and Carl muttered something under his breath. I turned back toward the door, expecting to see it swing open. But no. It was sealed tight, locked, and I knew, without a doubt, that it hadn't been locked before. Maybe it's just the wind, I said, but my voice didn't sound convinced. Even to my own ears, I felt it, an icy draft that whispered through the cracks in the walls, as if the building itself was breathing. We moved deeper into the building, our boots crunching on the old, brittle floors. It was clear this place had been abandoned for a long time. Old military equipment, rusted and useless, sat abandoned in corners. A few broken down desks and chairs. But there was something about the way everything was arranged, like someone had just walked away, like someone had been here recently. Guys, this place doesn't feel right, Natalie said, her voice trembling slightly. I feel like I'm being watched. Everyone feels that way in a place like this. Jake laughed, though it sounded hollow, forced. He was the brave one of the group, always the first to crack a joke when things got too quiet. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that gnawed at him. It was the kind of feeling you get when someone is standing just behind you. But when you turn around, no one's there. We all knew what it meant, but we kept walking. By the time we reached the next hallway, something had changed. The hall stretched out in front of us, dark and narrow, and yet, as we walked further, the lights seemed to flicker in and out, as if they were struggling to stay on, fighting something we couldn't see. I looked over my shoulder. The door we'd come through? Still shut, but I had the nagging feeling that it hadn't been the wind that had closed it. Something had made that door close, and now, I realized, I couldn't remember which direction we had come from. Where's the exit? Carl asked, his voice low. Wasn't it just down the hall? I think it's this way, I said. but my voice wavered. I felt like I was leading us in circles. As we kept moving, the sense of being watched intensified. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I could feel eyes, heavy, pressing against my skin. I turned to Carl, who had been leading the way, and noticed his face had gone pale. "What is it?" I asked. "Something's not right," he muttered. "The layout's all wrong. I swear we passed that same door 3 times. He pointed to a door on our right, one we had passed before. "I know we passed it." Suddenly, the air shifted. A low rumble echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. Deep, almost like a growl. A sound I couldn't explain. And the lights, they flickered and died completely. It was the first time I truly felt the grip of fear. A tightness in my chest. We were trapped. "No," I whispered. "No way." I turned to Natalie. She looked back at me, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. "It's the ghosts," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones the stories talk about. They're here." "I don't believe in ghosts," I said, but even as I spoke, a shiver ran down my spine. It was a silly thing to say. Who was I kidding? The whispers in the walls, the closed doors, the eerie sense of something lurking behind us. I wasn't so sure anymore. We tried to leave. The door we'd come through, now locked tight. We tried another exit. Same result. Every path we chose led us deeper into the maze of corridors. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was rearranging itself. Like it was alive, shifting around us, trapping us in its labyrinth. At one point, Matt swore he saw something move at the end of the hallway. A shadow, tall and thin, that darted behind a corner just as we turned to look. We ran after it, but it was gone, like it had never been there at all. "Where the hell are we?" Jake growled, frustration in his voice. "This is insane. We're going in circles." But we weren't. I knew that much. We weren't moving in circles. We were being guided. The final straw came when we reached the room we'd first entered. The door opened, and inside, everything had changed. The tables we'd seen earlier had shifted. Chairs that had been scattered were now neatly arranged. The air, heavy with cold, had become even colder. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. It was tall, clad in an old military uniform, its face obscured by shadows. But I knew, deep in my bones, who it was. It was one of the soldiers who had died here, trapped in this place for eternity. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, and its voice wasn't a voice, it was a feeling, presence that flooded my mind. I backed away, stumbling, and before I knew it, I was running. I didn't look back. I never made it out of Ghost Base. I don't know how much time passed before the others found me, or if they ever did. I don't know if they're still here, wandering the hallways. I don't even know if I'm still me. But I can tell you this. Some places, some buildings, aren't meant to be found. And once you walk into them, once they mark you, they never let you go. Story number 2. The Ghosts of Kulis. It was a cold evening when I first came across the story of Kulis Air Force Base. I was a journalist, fresh from college and eager for a real assignment. And somehow, my beat led me to the cold, desolate stretches of Alaska. Kulis, once a bustling hub of military aviation, had been abandoned nearly 2 decades ago. Its runway sat empty now, the hangars silent, and the air was thick with the heavy, unspoken history of the men and women who had once been stationed there. The locals had a story about the place, one they didn't tell lightly, and it's a story I can't forget. I had been warned about Kulis by a few of the older townsfolk, the kind who still had a faint smell of whiskey on their breath and a glint in their eye. They all told me the same thing. The ghosts of the base still walked the grounds. "Don't go there," they said. "Not at night." They were only half joking, but like any young, arrogant fool, I ignored their warnings. I was determined to uncover the truth behind the rumors of restless spirits. So one evening, I drove to the outskirts of Anchorage, where the remnants of Kulis Base lay. forgotten and crumbling beneath a blanket of snow. The gate was rusted, barely standing, as if time itself had lost interest in the place. I parked my car just outside and stepped onto the cracked pavement. The air was unnervingly still, no hum of distant engines, no sound of life anywhere, just the soft crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I had been told to expect the usual signs of decay: abandoned buildings, shattered windows, peeling paint, but what struck me most was the silence. It was as if the entire base had been swallowed up by the past, and the world had forgotten it ever existed. As I wandered deeper into the complex, I could feel it, the weight of 1,000 memories pressing down on me. The hangars that once housed the fighter jets were now empty shells, their metal skeletons groaning in the wind. The control towers loomed over me like silent sentinels, their windows like eyes watching my every move. It wasn't until I reached the runway that I felt something shift. At first, it was just a vague sensation, a tingle at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. But then it came again, stronger this time, faint whine, like the distant hum of an engine, drifting through the frozen air. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. It was impossible. There were no planes left at Kulis. No planes had been stationed here for years. And yet, the sound grew louder, clearer, as though it was coming from the sky itself. I looked up, half expecting to see a ghostly aircraft streaking through the air. But there was nothing. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and bright in the cold night. The noise persisted, an echo from the past, like a memory that refused to fade. I began to move again. My curiosity piqued. I walked toward the old barracks, the building where the pilots used to stay. As I approached, I saw it just a flicker at first, like a shadow moving in the corner of my eye. A figure, dressed in a flight suit, standing by one of the broken windows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was barely visible, but it was unmistakable. It was the outline of a pilot, his posture rigid, his head slightly tilted as though listening for something. Or perhaps, waiting. I stepped closer, my feet dragging through the snow, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the building, I looked up, my eyes tracing the window where the figure had stood. But now, it was empty. There was no one there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the pilot to reappear, to give some sign that I had not imagined it. But nothing, just the wind, the snow, and the silence. But then, in the distance, I heard it again, the whine of a jet engine, closer this time, as though a plane was flying low over the base. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, but I saw nothing in the sky. The sound grew louder, almost deafening, as though it were right next to me. And then, from the shadows, I saw it, a figure in a flight suit, walking slowly across the runway, his face obscured by the darkness. He moved with purpose, his boots crunching in the snow, and I could hear the faintest sound of his breath as he exhaled into the cold air. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond. He kept walking, his pace steady, until he was swallowed by the darkness beyond the runway. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. It was as though the base had come alive with memories of its past, memories that refused to let go, memories of pilots long gone. I wanted to run, but something in me, the journalist, the skeptic, kept me there. I followed the figure, my feet moving of their own accord, through the snow, past the hangars, until I reached the old control tower. The door was ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out from within. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of old leather and oil, the remnants of a time when the base had been full of life. But now, the walls were covered in dust, the floor littered with debris, and there, standing by the window, was the figure again, the same flight suit, the same rigid posture. He was staring out into the darkness, his face still hidden. I didn't speak this time. I didn't know what to say. I just watched him. And then, without warning, the figure turned, slowly, Deliberately, he stepped toward me, his boots scraping against the floor. His face was still obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold, unblinking. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, and that's when I saw it, a reflection in the glass. Behind me, standing in the doorway, was a second figure. Pilot, just like the first. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The hum of the jet engines, the footsteps, the presence of the pilot, all of it faded into the night. But the memory, the feeling that I was being watched, stayed with me. I left Coolis the next morning, my mind haunted by what I'd seen. I never went back, and I never will. Some things are better left in the past, especially in places like Coolis Air Force Base, where the souls of the pilots still fly, even after the runway has gone cold. Story number 3. The Haunting of Fort Richardson. The first time I set foot in Fort Richardson, I thought it would be like any other military base, drab, utilitarian, and full of the usual sense of institutional indifference. But it wasn't like that. No, there was something strange about Fort Richardson, something I couldn't place at first, but that gnawed at me the longer I stayed. I was stationed at the base as a young soldier, just a kid, really, fresh out of basic training, eager to prove myself, and a little more than naive about the world beyond the drill fields. My duties were simple enough: inventory, maintenance, and organizing equipment in the vast, cavernous warehouses that dotted the base. But it wasn't the work that troubled me. It was the silence, the oppressive, eerie silence that seemed to fill the air in every hallway and room. Most of the soldiers I worked with had been stationed at Fort Richardson for years. They were grizzled, veteran types, and they'd seen their fair share of strange things, they claimed. But none of them ever said much about it, especially not to a rookie like me. I remember once asking an old sergeant about it. After I'd heard him muttering something about the old storage buildings, he just grunted and said, "The base is haunted. Everyone who works here knows it. But it's not the kind of ghost that tries to kill you. It's worse. It wears you down." I laughed it off at the time. Ghosts? I was too young to believe in that stuff. But the deeper I got into the job, the more I understood what he meant. It was a Tuesday night when it happened, the night that changed everything. I was assigned to work in one of the older storage warehouses that had been left mostly untouched for years. The building was set apart from the rest of the base, tucked away at the far edge of the compound, its windows dark and uninviting. The hallways inside smelled of dust, rust, and something faintly metallic like old blood. The overhead lights flickered constantly, and there was always an odd hum in the air, like static electricity, just beneath the surface. I had been alone in the building for hours, organizing crates of old military supplies, useless equipment that had been forgotten by time. The work was tedious, but it gave me a sense of purpose. I was nearly done when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the creaking of the old metal doors, or maybe a draft. But no. There was a noise, footsteps, muffled, like someone was walking just beyond the rows of stacked crates. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know anyone else was supposed to be in the building, and the footsteps sounded too deliberate to be the wind or just the building settling. I grabbed a flashlight from my belt and started moving toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just the sound of soft, slow footsteps echoing down the long hall. I froze. The footsteps were getting closer. They were too regular, too methodical, like the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I turned a corner, flashlight held high, and that's when I saw it. The door to one of the storage rooms was slowly swinging open. It wasn't supposed to be open. It was one of the old equipment rooms that had been sealed for years. The heavy, automatic door should have remained locked. But there it was, standing ajar, and there was something wrong about it. Something unnatural. The door opened on its own. My pulse quickened. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if something was pulling me toward the door. something invisible but powerful. Like a force I couldn't resist. I stepped forward, flashlight beam shaking in my hand. I peered inside. The room was completely dark, save for the small beam of light from my flashlight. I could barely make out the shapes of old crates stacked in the corners. But what caught my eye was the temperature shift. The air inside the room was cold, unnaturally cold. My breath misted in front of me, and I felt a chill settle deep into my bones, as though the very air had turned to ice. I stepped into the room, against every instinct in my body telling me to turn back. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a loud metallic clang. My heart skipped in my chest, and I spun around, shining my light on the door. It was solid, locked in place. There was no way it had closed that quickly by itself. I swallowed hard and turned back to the darkness of the room. And that's when I heard it. The whisper. It started softly, barely perceptible, but as I strained my ears, it grew louder. It was coming from the far corner of the room, just beyond the stacks of crates. The voice, or voices, were faint, but unmistakable. Get out. Leave. I wasn't sure if the whispers were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but they seemed to come from all around me, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me, as though the walls themselves were closing in. And then, I saw it. In the darkness, just beyond the light of my flashlight, a shape moved. It was tall, humanoid like a person, but wrong. Somehow, the edges of the figure seemed to flicker and waver, like smoke in the wind. Couldn't make out any details, but the outline was unmistakable. I tried to shout, but my voice caught in my throat. I reached for the door, fumbling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder now, more urgent. Leave. Now. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, my legs frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The cold had seeped into my bones, numbing my limbs. That's when the door opened again, slowly, deliberately. I didn't hesitate. I bolted, stumbling out of the room, barely able to see through the tears in my eyes. I didn't look back as I ran down the hallway, through the dimly lit corridors, until I finally reached the exit. I didn't stop running until I reached the main gate. The next morning, I was back at the base, sitting in the mess hall, unable to shake the memory of what I had seen or what I had heard. I wasn't the first to experience it. There had been others. Some said it was just the echoes of war, phantoms of soldiers long gone. Others said it was the land itself, cursed by the horrors that had occurred there. But I knew one thing for sure. Something in Fort Richardson wasn't right, and it had been waiting for me. I never went back to that storage room, and I never went back to the base. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again, and I can feel the cold. I wonder if I'm the only one who still hears them. Story number 4. The Whispers of Clear Air Force Station. I thought it would be easy, a simple assignment to document the state of an old military facility in the middle of Alaska. A few days of work cataloging abandoned equipment, snapping photos of rusted radar dishes, and checking off boxes on a clipboard. That's all I expected. I didn't expect the whispers. Clear Air Force Station had been a Cold War relic, a sentinel standing watch over the vast skies of North America. Its massive radar arrays once scanned for ballistic missile threats, listening to the heavens for any sign of an incoming attack. By the time I arrived in the early 2000s, it was little more than a graveyard of outdated technology, its purpose relegated to the annals of history. I was part of a small team sent to assess the condition of the site and determine what could be salvaged. It was routine work, boring even, but as soon as I stepped onto the base, I felt it, a sense of unease, a heaviness in the air that didn't belong. The base itself was a shell of its former self. The main building, where the radar arrays had been housed, loomed large against the gray Alaskan sky. The wind howled through broken windows, carrying with it the faint scent of metal and decay. Most of the equipment had been decommissioned, stripped for parts or left to rust. Yet, as we walked through the halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It started on the second day. I was in the main control room, a cavernous space filled with rows of consoles and monitors that hadn't been powered on in decades. The room was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the building settling. I was cataloging the equipment, checking serial numbers, when I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice, a whisper. "Help!" I froze, my pen hovering above the clipboard. The word was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I turned, expecting to see one of my colleagues standing behind me, playing a prank. But the room was empty. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. No response. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind passing through the cracks in the building. But deep down, I knew better. That night, as we sat around a makeshift camp inside the base, I asked the others if they'd heard anything strange. Greg, one of the engineers, gave me a look. "You heard it too, huh?" he said, his voice low. "Heard what?" I asked, though I already knew. "The whispers," he said. "I've been hearing them since we got here. Thought it was just me losing my mind." Lisa, the project lead, laughed nervously. "Come on, guys, it's an old building. Probably just the wind." But I could see the fear in her eyes. She had heard them too. The whispers grew louder as the days went on. At first, they were sporadic, fleeting, but by the end of the week, they were constant. Sometimes, it sounded like a single voice, soft and mournful. Other times, it was a chorus, overlapping whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The worst part? They were coming from the radar arrays. The arrays had been decommissioned decades ago, their circuits gutted, their power long since cut. But every time I walked past the control panel, I heard them, the whispers, faint but persistent, like a ghostly signal trying to break through the static. One night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't take it anymore, the whispers, the unease, the sense that something was watching us. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a tape recorder, I made my way to the radar tower. The tower was massive, a skeletal structure of metal and wires that stretched into the sky. As I climbed the stairs to the top, the whispers grew louder. They weren't words anymore. Not exactly. They were sounds, moans, cries, distorted voices that seemed to vibrate through the air. When I reached the top, I found the source, or at least, I thought I did. The radar dish stood silent, a hulking relic of the past. But as I approached, I felt a vibration beneath my feet, a low hum that seemed to resonate through my entire body. I placed my hand on the control panel, and that's when I heard it. "Help us!" The voice was clear now, louder than before. It wasn't coming from the dish. It was coming from the ground. I don't remember running back down the tower. I don't remember bursting into the main building, gasping for breath as I tried to explain what I'd heard. All I know is that I wasn't the only one. Greg had been in the control room when it happened. He said the monitors flickered on, even though they weren't connected to any power source. And on the screens, he saw them, faces, dozens of them, pale and ghostly, staring out at him from the static. Lisa called it quits the next morning. She didn't say why, but I could see it in her eyes. She'd heard the whispers too. We left Clear Air Force Station later that day, our assignment unfinished. The base was sealed up, left to rot in the Alaskan wilderness. But I couldn't forget what I'd heard, what I'd seen. The whispers, the faces, the feeling of being watched. It stayed with me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear them again. The whispers, the voices, calling out from the static, from the shadows. "Help us!" I don't know what happened at Clear Air Force Station. I don't know what they were experimenting with, what they unleashed. But I know one thing. Something is still there, trapped beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen. and I fear that one day, someone will. Story number 5. The Ghosts of Elmendorf. I never believed in ghosts. Never. Not until that night at Elmendorf. You have to understand. I'm a man of science. A man of reason. I'm a researcher. And for years, I've been the type who dismisses strange occurrences as nothing more than coincidence, imagination, or the tricks of the mind. But that night, at the old Air Force Base in Anchorage, Alaska, something changed. It started like any other routine field assignment. The base had been partially decommissioned years ago, and most of the facilities were shut down or repurposed. The air was cold, that bite of Alaskan winter already creeping in. But there was nothing unusual about the mission I was given. My team and I were sent to conduct a security assessment on some of the abandoned buildings left behind. We were supposed to confirm that the area was clear, and then we'd head back to the city, probably with nothing more than a few tired legs and a checklist to mark off. But what I didn't know was that something was waiting for us, waiting for me. Inside that place, we arrived just after sunset, the fading light casting long, eerie shadows over the half-empty base. The area around Elmendorf was peaceful, the usual buzz of military aircraft and activity replaced by an unnatural quiet. We parked near the main entrance, the old gates creaking slightly in the wind. The chill seemed to seep into my bones almost immediately, and I pulled my coat tighter around me as we began walking to the first of the abandoned buildings. The first building was a maintenance hangar, large and empty. I wasn't surprised to see that there was nothing of interest. No signs of intrusion. No signs of anything at all, really. But as we moved deeper into the compound, toward the barracks, I began to feel it, a sense of unease, like being watched. There's a feeling you get when you walk into an old house, a place that's been abandoned for too long, and you just know something is wrong. It's not the creaking of the wood or the cold spots in the air. It's deeper than that. It's like the place remembers you're there, like it has a history you can't touch. But it's still there, watching. That was the first time I felt it. A shiver that ran down my spine and made the hairs on my neck stand up. I chalked it up to the isolation of the base, the silence of the surrounding woods, the long months of winter that can make anyone a little jumpy. But then I saw it. It was around midnight, the shadows stretching long through the empty halls of the barracks as I walked past a row of windows. The light from my flashlight cut through the darkness, casting eerie beams across the walls. And that's when I saw it. The figure. First, I thought it was one of my colleagues, standing by the window, waiting for me. But when I called out, there was no answer. I called again, louder this time, my voice echoing through the empty hall. Still nothing. I approached the window slowly, the floor creaking beneath my boots. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its form outlined in the moonlight filtering through the frosted glass. I stopped in front of the window, my breath fogging up the glass. That's when I saw it clearly. The figure wasn't wearing the uniform of an Air Force officer or even a civilian. No, this figure was different. It was an older uniform, military but from a time long past. The fabric was worn, threadbare at the edges, and the figure's face was obscured, hidden in the shadows. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the figure. Seconds? Minutes? Time didn't seem to matter. It was as if the world around me had frozen in that moment. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside, suspended in time. Then, suddenly, the figure turned its head. I don't know how I knew it, but I felt it this cold, knowing glance from the other side of the glass. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. I expected it to vanish the way ghosts do in movies, but it didn't. I pushed the door open, stepping into the room. The air inside was cold, almost suffocating. My flashlight swept the dark space, and I called out once more. "Hey, is someone in here?" No answer. I walked across the floor, my boots tapping against the tile, until I was standing directly in front of the window. I stared into the glass, expecting nothing more than a reflection of my own face, illuminated by the flashlight's beam. But when I looked up, the figure was gone, vanished. There was nothing but the emptiness of the dark, broken only by the faintest shadow in the corner of the room. I don't know what happened next. I was frozen, unable to move, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd seen. Was I imagining things? Could the isolation be playing tricks on me? Maybe the stress of the assignment was catching up to me. But when I turned around, I saw him again. The soldier. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, staring at me with hollow eyes, his body shrouded in shadow. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched. I could feel his gaze boring into me, like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. I wanted to run. I should have run. But I didn't. The soldier didn't step forward. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, like he was waiting for me to come closer. And I couldn't resist. I took a step forward, then another, my boots echoing off the walls as I moved down the dark corridor. With each step, I could feel the weight of something ancient and heavy pressing in on me. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, as if the base itself was alive with memories that refused to die. And then, without warning, the air shifted, the temperature dropped. I felt it in my bones. A cold that wasn't of this world. Cold that didn't belong. The soldier was gone. I blinked and looked around. But I was alone. The corridor was empty. I don't remember much after that. I don't remember how I left the base, or how I got back to the car. What I remember is the silence that followed. The unnerving silence of the place that wouldn't let me forget what I'd seen. Elmendorf is full of ghosts. I learned that night that some things don't stay dead. Even when the buildings have crumbled and the people have gone. Some things linger, waiting, watching, and I'm not sure if they ever really leave. But what haunts me the most is that moment. The moment when I looked into the empty hallway and knew I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Story number 6. The screams beneath Fort Greely. I had never been to Alaska before, and in all honesty, I never thought I'd end up in a place as remote as Fort Greely. The assignment seemed simple enough, a routine check of an abandoned military installation that had been decommissioned years ago. But no one told me about the darkness that clung to those hollowed-out concrete walls, or the sounds that seeped from the earth itself like blood from an open wound. Fort Greely was a ghost. It had once been one of the most strategic military sites in the United States, a hub for missile defense systems and classified weapons testing, tucked away in the heart of Alaska's wilderness. But when the Cold War ended, the base was abandoned, the soldiers left, the weapons were decommissioned, the government sealed off the site, and the only ones who visited were researchers, thrill seekers, and a few bored locals who swore they could hear strange things at night if they ventured too close. I'd heard the rumors. Everyone had. The stories of strange noises echoing through the empty tunnels beneath the base. The whispers of haunted halls and unexplained shadows. But I didn't believe them. No one did. Really. At least not until they were standing on the edge of that place, feeling the weight of its history pressing down on their chest. I was part of a small team from the Department of Defense tasked with documenting the state of the underground bunkers. They'd been closed off for years, left untouched except for the occasional scavenger or urban explorer who thought they could brave the eerie isolation. I wasn't scared. At first. How could I be? It was just an old military base. After all, we had our gear, our flashlights, and our training. But as we descended into the bowels of Fort Greely's underground complex, something began to change. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the corner of my vision, a faint movement behind a door that shouldn't have been able to move. I figured it was nothing, but the deeper we went, the more the air seemed to change. It became thicker, heavier, as though the very walls of the base were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. We reached the first of the bunkers after an hour of descending through rusted, winding staircases and narrow hallways. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and oil. It was like stepping into a forgotten world, one that had been left behind in haste. I felt a strange unease settle in my stomach, Let's get this over with, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the sensation. The others in my group were all business, scanning the equipment, taking notes, and snapping pictures of the old missile silos and storage rooms. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something was here, and it wasn't happy about it. We made our way to the deepest section of the bunker. The steel doors were rusted shut, but with a little force, we managed to open them. The sound of the door scraping against the floor echoed through the chamber. And that's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a sigh, but deeper, like the earth itself was exhaling. I turned to my colleague, Greg, but he didn't seem to hear it. I pressed a finger to my lips, motioning for silence. Then, I heard it again. A scream, a sharp, agonizing cry that cut through the silence like a knife. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, couldn't breathe. It was the sound of someone in unimaginable pain. But the scream wasn't human. Not fully. There was something raw, something other about it. Did you hear that? I whispered, but Greg just looked at me, confused. Hear what? He asked. He didn't hear it. None of them did. They were too focused on the task at hand. But I heard it, and the others would hear it soon enough. We moved deeper into the bunker, and as we passed each room, the temperature dropped. My breath fogged up in front of me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up straight. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each step. The walls felt alive, as if they were pulsing with the energy of something trapped deep beneath the surface. Then came again, the sound of scratching, like something was scraping against the walls. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. No rats, no insects, just the oppressive silence of the empty base. But then we heard the voices, soft, distant whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They were unintelligible at first, but as we ventured deeper into the heart of the bunker, the whispers grew louder, clearer. Help us! Help us! I froze. The words were unmistakable, like a cry from the depths of hell itself. The voices sounded desperate, pleading, and they weren't human. At least, not entirely. What the hell is that? Greg asked, his voice cracking. I could see the fear in his eyes now. He was no longer the confident, level-headed colleague I had known. We all felt it, the unmistakable, suffocating sense of something watching us, something trapped in the dark corners of the bunker. The whispers turned into something else. A low, rhythmic pounding. Thump, 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 like something was trying to break free. Something powerful, something alive. And then, there was a scream, a blood-curdling, soul-ripping scream that echoed through the bunker, shaking the very ground beneath our feet. It came from one of the deep storage rooms we had yet to enter. But by the time we reached it, there was nothing there. No body, no evidence of anyone ever being there. Just the sound. The air was thick with it now. The stench of something decaying, something ancient. The walls seemed to close in on us, as if the very space we occupied was alive, pressing in from all sides. The longer we stayed, the more distorted the sounds became, voices, whispers, screams, and thumps that were all blending into one chaotic symphony of terror. We tried to leave, but the doors wouldn't open. I swear to God, we were trapped in that damned place with whatever it was that lived beneath the surface. We fought with the doors for what felt like hours, but they didn't budge. The only sounds were those maddening whispers, now growing louder, until they felt like they were coming from inside my skull. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The doors opened. The others scrambled out of the bunker, running into the cold Alaskan air like their lives depended on it. But me, I had to look. I had to know. I turned back to the darkness, to the whispering, to the screaming. I never saw the others again. Some say I ran with them, but I know the truth. I stayed behind. I heard the voices, the souls of the lost soldiers, the ones who never left Fort Greely, and they called to me. They called me to stay. The screeches, the wails, they're still there. I can hear them sometimes, in my sleep, and sometimes, I swear, I hear them calling my name. Help us, help us. I know one day, they'll come for me. They'll drag me down into the darkness beneath Fort Greely, where I'll join the others, the lost, the damned. And when the wind howls through the cold Alaskan nights, it's their voices I'll hear, and they'll be waiting for you, too. Story number 7. The Ghosts of Adak Base. I never believed in ghosts. I used to laugh at the stories, roll my eyes when people talked about spirits lingering in places, trapped by their unfinished business or violent deaths. But that was before I spent 3 weeks at the Adak military base. That was before I saw things I couldn't explain. Adak wasn't just any old military post. Nestled on a remote island in Alaska's Aleutian chain, the base had been a hub of activity during World War II, and later, during the Cold War, a strategic location that housed thousands of soldiers and housed military equipment, planes, and weapons that were essential to the defense of the United States. By the time I arrived in the early 2000s, the place had been shut down for nearly a decade. The buildings were abandoned, the runways cracked and weathered by years of harsh winds and bitter cold. But still, I had a job to do. I was with a team of archaeologists and military historians sent to catalog the ruins of the base, to find whatever remnants of the past might be left behind. I was excited. Of course, it was a rare opportunity to explore a place so deeply rooted in history, even if it had been left to rot. It wasn't the kind of place that tourists visited, unless they were looking for something truly unique. But what I didn't expect, the thing I never saw coming, was that Adak had more history buried within it than I could have imagined. History that wasn't written in books. History that was alive. It was the first night that things started to feel wrong. We had set up camp inside one of the old barracks. The place smelled of mildew and rust. The air stale with the weight of forgotten years. The wind outside howled, a mournful wail that seemed to echo through the corridors of the building. It was cold. Colder than I expected for an Alaskan winter. But that wasn't the unsettling part. It wasn't until we started to hear the footsteps. First, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps a mouse scurrying through the walls. But as the hours dragged on, the sounds grew louder, the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots, soldiers' boots, echoing through the empty halls. We all heard it. All of us, my team. 3 other historians and archaeologists, who'd been working here for days, cataloging old bunkers and abandoned aircraft hangars. But when we investigated, there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The footsteps vanished. I tried to brush it off. It was probably just the building settling. But as the night wore on, the noises intensified. Soon, we began hearing whispers, low, guttural voices speaking in hushed tones. They sounded like conversations happening just beyond the door, in the room next door. But when we opened it, nothing was there. Nothing except the smell of cigarette smoke. Something that lingered despite the years of neglect. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My colleague, Dr. Lisa Hines, a soft-spoken historian from Boston, was the first to admit that she was starting to feel uncomfortable. She'd always been skeptical, but something about Adak was getting under her skin. She didn't want to admit it at first, but her face betrayed her when she started to mention seeing shapes moving in the periphery of her vision. Shadows that didn't belong to us. Figures standing in the corners of the rooms, watching us, waiting. It wasn't long before we all began to experience strange things. I started hearing my name being called, a voice deep and raspy, like the sound of someone yelling from far away. But when I turned to look, no one was there. My team members started having dreams of soldiers, their faces twisted with fear, calling out for help, only to disappear into the shadows. And then, there were the screams. One night, it was Josh, our youngest member, who first heard it. He claimed it came from the other side of the building, deep in the bowels of the old hospital wing. The sound was unmistakable. A man screaming in agony, a long, drawn-out scream that seemed to echo through the walls, reverberating into our very bones. We ran to investigate, but by the time we reached the hospital wing, everything was silent, just the wind and the stillness of the decaying base. But the damage had already been done. We were being watched. We could feel it. Someone or something was keeping an eye on us. The air in the rooms was thick, oppressive, like the atmosphere was charged with something dark, something angry. It was Lisa who found it first, the old radio, hidden away in one of the storage rooms. It hadn't been used in years, maybe decades, but when she turned it on, crackled to life. The static was loud at first, but then there was something else. Voices, faint, almost unintelligible. But there, we tried to record it, but it always disappeared when we played it back. The next day, we decided to investigate further. We dug through the military archives, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. We found reports of soldiers who had gone missing during the height of the Cold War, men who'd been stationed at Adak and vanished without a trace. And then there were the whispers of the men who died here, those who'd seen the horrors of war and were left to wander the base forever. Their spirits, some said, never left. They were still here, still haunting the place. That night, as the wind howled and the moon hung heavy in the sky, we ventured out to the old barracks. There was something waiting for us, something we couldn't see, but we could feel, a presence that pressed in on us, suffocating and cold. The whispers grew louder, the shadows lengthened, stretching across the walls like fingers reaching for us. The temperature dropped. Our breath came out in foggy puffs, even though the heater was on. And then we saw them, figures, ghostly soldiers, walking slowly down the hallways, their faces distorted in terror. Their uniforms were faded and torn, their eyes wide with an expression of deep, agonizing fear. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming. They walked through the walls, fading into the night, only to reappear moments later. I never saw them leave. By the time we left Adak, I don't think any of us were the same. Josh, who had been the first to experience the screams, left the team. He wouldn't talk about what he saw, but I knew. He knew, and he wasn't coming back. We all saw something that couldn't be explained, something that, to this day, still chills me to the bone. The ghosts of Adak weren't just the spirits of the soldiers who died. They were something more, something trapped, unable to move on, forever stuck in a cycle of suffering and torment. And I swear to you, the last time I left the island, I felt something following me, something still watching, still waiting. I should have believed in ghosts, but even now, I know they're real. They never left. And if you're ever on that island, just remember, when the wind howls, when the night feels too cold, you're not alone, not by a long shot.